lives as college football fans, where it just sort of seems like anything is possible, right? I mean, we have so many different kinds of news stories that bubble up. And, you know, I think those of us who are fans, or in my case, someone who works speaking to fans on a daily basis, we just sort of have to be ready for anything at all times. And sometimes it's not so great news. Other times it actually really is very good news. An example of the latter here right now, yesterday on social media, Marcus Washington Jr., Georgia defensive back commit for the class of 2023, top 100, player in the country, top 10 defensive back type guy. This is a very big deal, big time prospect for the 2023 class, but now he is reclassifying to the 2022 class. He had just taken an official visit to Athens a little early, kind of mid-May for an official visit for a player of that caliber, but now you understand maybe why that was, because he is now kind of moving into that class of 2022 for Georgia. Also, when you add Washington, and we talked about this last week, when you look at the Slim Singletaries and the Dalen Everetts and the Julian Humphreys, obviously Malachi Starks at the safety position, you start now adding a Marcus Washington Jr. into all of that it's not crazy to say that the defensive back haul for Georgia in the class of 2022 is historically good. It'd be easy for someone like me to say the greatest of all time. And, frankly, I don't have every defensive back class of all time, certainly committed to full memory here. But that many elite type prospects, that many 5 stars, that many top 100 type guys, adding Washington into that discussion, boy, you got to imagine it's in a pretty historic category. You have to assume that it probably is. Obviously, a lot of folks also know that Marcus' father played at UGA. So we're talking about a guy that understands the value of the Silver Britches, the value of the Georgia program all the way around. And this is a little bit of an alleviation for something that Kirby Smart was said was a concern for him, which was a lack of depth, just total numbers when it involves defensive backs, that Kirby felt like they needed more. And to bring in a guy like this, you certainly get a chance to do that. We've talked about reclassified guys before. I think there's something to be said for a defensive back reclassifying as opposed to like a bigger guy that's playing the front 7 or along the line of scrimmage. I think big guys against other big guys, I think a little bit of age probably helps you. Could a guy like Washington be more ready as a defensive back? I think probably so. Now, maybe that's just my own ignorance speaking there. Maybe that's not quite as easy as I'm treating it to be. But to me, the transition for a player who relies on speed and quickness is a little bit easier for a younger guy than someone who's going to rely on that size and strength. I just think it's a little bit easier to talk about a reclassified defensive back than maybe a player from another position. I'll also tell you this. I don't think Georgia's doing this kind of thing unless they thought he had a chance to help out. In other words, they didn't bring him in a year early. I mean, Kirby Smart loves high school football. They didn't bring him in a year early. They didn't take him away from his senior year simply so he could be a project player and sit on the end of the bench and, watch and learn. That if they're taking this right now as a reclassified 2022 player, I think the automatic assumption you should probably have is that Georgia thinks this is a player capable of potentially helping them out, certainly being a factor in what we expect to be an intense competition for playing time. So this is a fascinating story. It's the kind of thing we've just kind of come to expect that, hey, Georgia's going to do anything it can to add talent to its roster, even at a time in which the average person's like, wait, does Georgia have 319 people on scholarship? That this is just kind of the way it goes. That Kirby's not looking to get below a number. Kirby's looking to get full use out of the available number that he has. Reclassified elite talent, an example of that. So, interesting addition here to the class of 2022. You can read more about this at the pages of DawgNation.com. And in fact, we'll keep this conversation going with Connor Riley here coming up there as well. In addition to that, some of the other stuff, Kirby Smart actually made 2 different interview appearances last week. I thought he said some interesting things in both of those discussions. So, there's actually a little bit going on here right now with Georgia football in terms of adding players to the roster, but also looking ahead to the start of summer practices, which will be here before you know it. June, also a busy time for recruiting there too. So what do you say we cover all of that right now and a lot more? It's a Kroger Fresh Take here with Connor Riley. Glad to have him and all of you with us in the program today.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Good morning to Connor Riley hanging out with us here today. As we said before, kind of a lot going on with Georgia here right now, so we'll cover a lot of that with Connor here for the moment. Connor, you heard me just share a little bit of brief thoughts here on the Washington thing. I'm not always in favor of reclassification, to be honest with you. I mean, there's a part of me that thinks age probably matters. And listen, I also think that high school is probably a pretty good experience that I don't think you should be in too big of a hurry to move on from that stage of your life. College is always going to be waiting for you. But, listen, I don't think that Georgia would be looking to bring him in right now. They didn't think he had a chance to really help them and be a part of a competition for playing time or whatever else. What did you think specifically about the addition here to the 2022 class from a guy that would really stood out as one of the top prospects in the 2023 class?
Yeah, so we know Georgia's wanted to add to its defensive back room in terms of just the available bodies back there. They only had 4 scholarship cornerbacks with them during spring practice, and I think that did limit necessarily what they were able to do there. And so you go out, you add another top 100 overall type prospect in Marcus Washington Jr., a guy who has been committed to Georgia for a while. I believe he was technically their first 2023 commitment, if memory serves me correctly there. And he's a guy who, again, I think as you point out, he wouldn't be here if Georgia didn't think that he could help them in some meaningful fashion early on in his career at Georgia. Now, obviously, there's a lot of other talent coming in this summer with Julian Humphrey out of Texas and Jaheim Singletary out of Jacksonville. So I'm going to be interested to see how those 4 defensive backs, when I'm including Dalen Everett there as well, who's already enrolled and went through spring practice, sort of sort themselves out in that cornerback room, because that's a lot of cornerbacks to bring in at one point in time. But I also think it pretty clearly shows Georgia knows they have further to go to address some of the concerns in their secondary. I wonder if Georgia feels compelled to move any of those guys to that safety position, because I do sort of think safety is the bigger issue as it stands right now with where things are with Georgia in terms of their defensive back room. But again, this defensive backfield was so thin this spring. It was so obvious just watching them in spring practice. Getting an extra body with a guy who has great size, 6'1", I think 180 pounds and runs, in the 10s in terms of 100-meter dash times. I think that's something that every team in America would sign up for to get. The fact that you're getting him at this point in the cycle seems like a positive for Georgia.
Georgia now from taking defensive back in the transfer portal.
The only reason I'd be compelled to say yes to the fact that they may not take a player from the transfer portal is just I need to know more about, and we'll never get the answer to this, obviously, how are they going about counting the scholarship? Because if, theoretically he blue shirts and they count him as a summer arrivee and start him on scholarship August 1st, it sort of allows Georgia to keep its sort of scholarship numbers the same, and you could still possibly add there. I would add as well that, okay, let's say they do take Washington and that adds some more depth to the defensive backfield room. We know Georgia still, I think, wants to take a wide receiver, provided the right one is in there. And so now does it come down to, all right, they've looked at who's in the transfer portal, who's become available. They think wide receiver is necessarily a bigger need than safety and felt, all right, hey, Marcus Washington's in a spot where he can come enroll early. And when I say enroll early, we obviously mean a full year early there and help us in that way and know that while we may not have the experienced player that we want to have, we know we're having a guy who's going to develop over the course of the season and possibly be ready, or someone else in that room be ready by the end of the year, where I think we all know, as sort of David Pollack touched on, this defense is going to be, the defense is going to be a work in progress over the course of the year. And so it's okay that you don't have a ready-made player week 1.
Point for a moment. Last year, Georgia takes Darian Kendrick. That's an all-ACC type guy from Clemson. It's an example of what Georgia thought that it needed. So maybe if you're a Georgia fan, this is great news. Georgia doesn't really feel like it needs an experienced Darian Kendrick anymore. So therefore, it's happy kind of bringing in an inexperienced talent because it's comfortable enough with everything else it has in the program. Or on the flip side of that, maybe Georgia went out and tried to find its 2022 version of Darian Kendrick and couldn't. Either that player was in the portal or Georgia couldn't get him or whatever else. And so therefore was, I hate to say forced to add another talented but young player at a position where we're kind of led to believe that experience really matters. You've got the very positive assessment of this of Georgia feels like even though the numbers are small, the talent's enough that it doesn't really need the Kendrick-style experience. Or the flip side of that, which is they tried that, they went shopping, shelves were barren. It was like the baby formula of recruiting, and now adding another young, inexperienced player. Which of those two sides of the coin do you think more likely to be accurate? The more positive assessment, or maybe the more, negative assessment?
I would say the more realistic assessment, if there are a Darian Kendrick type player in the transfer portal at that cornerback position, Georgia, we would have known about him. We would have known who that is. It's not a guessing game with who that guy might have been. And the reality is, Darian Kendrick was an all SEC cornerback last year and showed up, 2 interceptions in the Orange Bowl. I don't believe there was that sort of player out there, either at that cornerback position or at that safety position. And so I guess if I have to classify that as a negative, I will do so. But I think that speaks to the larger sort of aversion that maybe Kirby Smart has to the transfer portal and relying on it in terms of, hey, yeah, we know we're going to have some holes, but we know we're going to be able to fill them in the transfer portal. Because the reality is there isn't that Darian Kendrick or even say Tyke Smith type player in the transfer portal right now, where an all conference player at another school, specifically a bigger school, that you feel like can come in, fit this Georgia team and help them get over the hump. The reality is that's not going to be available readily on a year in, year out basis. That's